Okay, so you know how everyone's talking about keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees?
Mm-hmm.
Well, today we're going deep on something called climate overshoot, which
Oh.
basically means what happens if we, miss that target.
Yeah, that's a big one, and it's looking more and more likely based on current projections.
Right, even with the Paris Agreement and all the efforts to cut emissions. So, to be clear, this isn't about like giving up on the Paris Agreement goals.
No, not at all.
It's more like, okay, what if we go a little
Hmm.
or a lotta
Yeah.
over that 1.5-degree limit before things start to cool down?
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the possibility of exceeding that limit, even if temporarily, and figuring out what that means.
Okay, that makes sense. But honestly, it's kind of freaking me out. So, can you give us like an example or something to help
Mhm.
wrap our heads around it?
Sure. Think of it like a bathtub.
The bathtub.
Yeah, imagine the bathtub is filling up with water, and that represents, the Earth's temperature rising.
Okay, I'm following.
The drain is open, right? And that's like our efforts to reduce emissions. We're letting some of that heat escape.
Got it. But the faucet's still running, right?
Exactly. Emissions are still happening. So
Right.
even with the drain open, the bathtub might still overfill for a bit before the water level starts going down.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's a good way to picture it. So basically, even though we're trying to slow down warming, there's still a chance we might go over the limit for a while before things stabilize.
Yeah.
And how is that different from like those tipping points we always hear about? Those really scare me.
Yeah, those are scary. Tipping points are like points of no return.
Right, right.
Once they're crossed, certain changes in the climate system become irreversible, even if we manage to reduce emissions after that.
So like it's too late no matter what we do.
Pretty much, yeah. Think of it like pushing over a domino. Once it falls, you can't stand it back up.
Yikes. Okay, that's a sobering thought. Can you give us an example of a tipping point that's relevant to this whole overshoot thing?
Sure. So one big concern is the melting of permafrost in the Arctic.
Right, the permanently frozen ground.
Exactly. And that permafrost contains huge amounts of methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas.
Way worse than carbon dioxide.
Oh, yeah, much worse. So if we overshoot 1.5 degrees for too long, there's a risk that large amounts of this methane could be released from the thawing permafrost.
And that would just make the warming even worse?
Exactly. It would accelerate the warming even further, making it harder to get back below that 1.5-degree threshold.
It's almost like a domino effect then, with the tipping point setting off a chain reaction.
Exactly. And speaking of chain reactions, we should also talk about feedback loops.
Oh, right. Those are another big climate concern, aren't they?
Definitely. Feedback loops are processes that amplify warming, making it harder to stabilize the climate.
It's like a vicious cycle, right?
Exactly. Like one example is the melting of ice sheets.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
Right. So as the ice sheets melt, the Earth's surface reflects less sunlight back into space.
Because the ice is all white and shiny, but the ground or water underneath is darker.
Exactly. And so less sunlight gets reflected, meaning more heat gets absorbed, which leads to even more warming and more melting.
It's like a snowball rolling down a hill getting bigger and bigger.
Exactly. And harder to stop.
Wow. Okay. So we've got tipping points, which are about irreversible change, and feedback loops, which make the warming worse. And then there's overshoot, where we might temporarily exceed the 1.5-degree limit. But even if it's temporary, you're saying it can still have really big consequences.
Yeah, even a temporary overshoot can have lasting and potentially irreversible impacts on ecosystems and human societies.
Can you give us some examples of those impacts?
Sure, so let's start with coral reefs. They're super sensitive to changes in temperature.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about that.
Yeah, even a small increase in temperature, especially if it lasts for a while, can cause coral bleaching, where the corals expel the algae that live inside them and give them their color.
And without those algae.
The corals can die. And coral reefs are home to a huge diversity of marine life. They provide food and livelihoods for millions of people, so losing them would be a massive blow.
Absolutely. What about impacts on land? Does overshoot affect those too?
Oh, definitely. Take agriculture, for example. Especially in regions that are already dry or prone to drought, exceeding 1.5 degrees, even temporarily, could make things much worse.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hotter temperatures mean more evaporation, right?
Exactly. So soils dry out faster, crops struggle to grow, and that can lead to food shortages and price increases.
Wow, it's like a ripple effect impacting so many different aspects of our lives.
It really is. And we can't forget about the impact on human health. Even a small increase in average temperature can lead to more frequent and severe heat waves.
And heat waves can be deadly, especially for vulnerable populations.
Exactly. They can also put a huge strain on healthcare systems and infrastructure.
So all in all, it's clear that overshoot, even if it's temporary, is something we really need to avoid or at least minimize as much as possible.
Absolutely. And the good news is the length of this overshoot period is still largely within our control.
So there's still hope.
Yes, definitely. It all comes down to how quickly and drastically we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Think back to that bathtub analogy.
Right. The faster we turn off the faucet, the less water spills over.
Exactly. It really highlights the urgency of climate action. The sooner and more decisively we act, the shorter and less severe the overshoot period will be.
So the key takeaway here is that while climate overshoot is a real possibility, the duration and severity of its impacts depend on our actions now.
Right. We have the power to shape the future. We can choose to act now and limit the damage, or we can delay and face the consequences.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. What if we do manage to limit the duration of climate overshoot? Can we actually reverse some of the damage that's been done? And what innovations and solutions might be needed to help restore those ecosystems and communities that have been most affected?
Food for thought.